Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Montesquieu Forum. This afternoon, we have a lecture on a book called The 1001 Nights, sometimes called The Arabian Nights. One has to hesitate, though, in calling it a book. There are a series of manuscripts, 4 main manuscripts, that have accumulated perhaps from as early as the 9th century in Persia through the 18th century. The first time that this book was published as The 1001 Nights was in 1704. It was not published in book form in Arabic, the language in which it's written, but rather in French translation. A man by the name of Antoine Galland managed to convince someone in Syria to send him this either 14th or 15th century manuscript. Which one it is a matter of contention. He translated the manuscript into French, and that's the language in which it was originally published. And along the way, other manuscripts were discovered, and other manuscripts were discovered, and other manuscripts were discovered. So if one asks a question, what is the book entitled, The 1001 Nights or The Arabian Nights? One is very hard-pressed to say, this is it. And thus, if one picks up different editions of the Arabian Nights, one will find different stories. One might even find stories about Sinbad, the sailor, or Aladdin and his knights, or one will not find such stories. This makes teaching the Arabian Nights or the 1001 Nights a somewhat difficult task, and it makes public presentations on the subject even more difficult. Hence, one has to bring in a friend to do this. But The 1001 Nights is one of the great books of world literature, and one of the things that makes it great is it's a series of interpolated or framed stories. Stories which morph into other stories, which morph into other stories. It's also a book about violence against women. And that brings me to our speaker. Our speaker today is Professor Melissa Matthes, who is a professor of government in the Department of Humanities at the United States Coast Guard Academy. That must be a story in and of itself. She received a PhD in government at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and long after that got an MDiv, a Master's of Divinity, at Yale University. There could not be 2 more different universities on the face of the earth than the University of California at Santa Cruz and Yale University. Nevertheless, she managed to attend both, survive both, and prosper. Her first book, and this brings me to the element of violence, is on the rape of Lucrezia and the founding of republics, readings on Livy, Machiavelli, and Rousseau. The rape of Lucrezia, which took place in the 6th century BC, is about the founding of what's called the Roman Republic. If one looks at Herodotus's histories, it begins with the rapes of Io, Europa, Helen. Somehow violence against women and the founding of polities seems to go hand in hand. For those of you who have even looked at the Arabian Nights, a story at the outset that has to do with Shahrazad and Sharia, and the killing of Shariah's wife and his brother's wife and many, many young women where Shariah rules, this is too a story about violence. Simultaneously, it's a story about speech and the relationship between speech and violence, and speech perhaps as a limit, a stopgap measure against violence. In addition to writing on the rape of Lucrezia, Professor Matthes has published a wonderful essay called Shahrazad Sisters in the Journal of Middle East Studies, Middle East Studies, I believe in 2009 is when that came out. She teaches on the subject of Arabic political thought, on African American political thought, on feminist political thought. She has a very broad reach when it comes to the subjects that interest her. I met her a long time ago, first at a Liberty Fund conference on the subject of Homer's Odyssey, and I thought that I could do nothing better than to invite her on another Odyssey to Roosevelt University and the Montesquieu Forum and to speak on Shahrazad and Arabian Nights. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you for all of you coming out. Feels like still the day after Thanksgiving. Like it's a perpetual day after Thanksgiving. I think I still left some dishes in the sink when I took the flight. I was like, oh, yeah, maybe somebody at home, one of my kids will do that. Not. Okay, so I want to do, I think, like 3 things in this talk, but try as much as possible to make it a conversation. The first is to try to make a claim a little bit about storytelling and politics and the human condition. And then second, do some, what you're probably used to, some exegesis of the frame story and maybe 1 or 2 of the tales. And then the last part, which might be the Divinity School part, is to kind of think about why is any of this still relevant today? What are some of the political and existential questions that thinking and reading Arabian Nights in 2022 might raise for us? So Elie Wiesel, the well-known Jewish thinker, says, God made human beings because he loves stories. I love this line, right? Some scholars assert that stories make societies work better by encouraging us to behave ethically. As with sacred myths, ordinary stories from TV shows to fairy tales, they steep us all in the same powerful norms and values. They seemingly stigmatize antisocial behavior and just as relentlessly celebrate pro-social behavior. We learn by association that if we are more like the protagonists, we will be more apt to reap the typical rewards of protagonists, for example, love and social advancement and other happy endings, and less likely to reap the rewards of the antagonist, death, disastrous loss of social standing. As human beings, we spend great chunks of our lives inside fictional stories, in worlds where goodness is generally endorsed and rewarded, and evil or badness is condemned and punished. These patterns don't just reflect a moralistic bias in human psychology, they actually seem to reinforce it. In his book, The Moral Laboratory, the Dutch scholar, whose name I will now butcher, Gemelian Hakamuller, reviewed dozens of scientific studies indicating that fiction has positive effects on readers' moral development and sense of empathy. In other words, when it comes to moral law, Shelley seems to have had it right. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Similar evidence comes from a recent TV study of viewers by the psychologist Marcus Appel. He argues that for society to function properly, people have to believe in justice. They have to believe that there are rewards for doing right and punishments for doing wrong. And indeed, people generally do believe that life punishes the vicious and rewards the virtuous. This is despite the fact that, as Appel puts it, this is patently not the case. Bad things happen to good people all the time, and most crimes go unpunished. I think of this as, in some ways, this idea that Dostoevsky has, that in order to live in the world, we have to believe somehow that it's enchanted, right? And that is part of what I think the Arabian Nights does. In Appel's study, people who mainly watch drama and comedy on television, as opposed to the heavy viewers of news programs and documentaries, your average college professor probably, had substantially stronger what he calls just world beliefs. Appel concludes that fiction, by constantly marinating our brains in the theme of poetic justice, may be partly responsible for the overly optimistic sense that the world is, on the whole, a just place. And yet the fact that we take the lessons to heart may be as important part of what makes human societies work. In recent centuries, technology has changed the communal nature of storytelling, but it has not destroyed it. Nowadays, we may imbibe most of our stories alone or with our families and friends, but we are still engaged in a socially regulating activity. I may be by myself watching Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones, but there are millions of other people sitting in millions of other couches, being exposed to the same stories and undergoing the same process of neural, emotional, and physiological attunement. We are still having a communal experience, it's just spread out over space and time. Even stories with moral ambiguity, like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad or Ozark, do not renounce moral codes, or I don't think they renounce moral codes. I think they simply put a fresh twist on old morality plays. Mephistopheles has always been charismatic, like Tony Soprano and Wendy Bird, but our fascination with them does not change our understanding or calculation of virtue, of human goodness, or of an ethical life, although it might make us appreciate further why it is so difficult and challenging to be good. Stories, in other words, continue to fulfill their ancient function of binding society together by reinforcing a set of common values and strengthening the ties of common culture. Stories enculturate the youth. It defines the people. It tells us what is laudable and what is contemptible. It subtly and constantly encourages us to be decent instead of decadent. Story is the grease and glue of society by encouraging us, I think, to behave well. It reduces social friction, or ideally it should reduce social friction, while uniting people around common values. Stories seek to homogenize us, to make us one. And of course that is part of the challenge around whose stories get told and in what context. I mean, we're having a kind of collective debate, I think, now about Twitter, right, with Elon Musk. Like, is the primary value that everything should be said in all ways at all times, or do we say, no, there's some things we don't want to be said? And we still, I think, have a kind of impulse that it really does matter, the stories that we tell, to whom we tell them, how we tell them, to one another, and that we risk dissolving our communities if we're not telling stories that in some way maybe both enchant us and enhance us, but simultaneously recognize the diversity, right? And I think that's part of what Arabian Nights does so well, right? It has that sense that we're coming together, right? Like the repetitions create some kind of unity, but we would be hard pressed to say, this is the answer that these stories tell us, or here's the one view that is exemplified here. And so they're, I think, a really powerful template for how do you do this kind of political work, right? How do you tell stories that both create community while being simultaneously diverse, or in our terms, or I don't know what terms you might use, but maybe being multicultural, or thinking about the subordinate or the subaltern, right? Like, how do you do all of those things? And I'm going to make my plea for Shahrazad as, the quintessential heroine or feminist icon for this kind of work. So stories, both sacred and profane, are perhaps in some ways the cohering force in human life. A society is composed, as I just said, of fractious people with different personalities and goals and agendas. But what connects us beyond our kinship ties? Storytelling. Joe Gardner puts it that fiction is essentially serious and beneficial, a game played against chaos and death, against entropy. Storytelling is the counterforce to social disorder, the tendency of things to fall apart. It is the center without which the rest cannot hold. Novelist Keith Oakley calls stories the flight simulators of human social life. So why has this luxury of fiction, Marina Warner asked this question, not been eliminated from human life? Why are we still telling stories? Whether the curated stories that some of you might tell on Instagram or Facebook, or the stories, right, that I think the average American still watches 5 to 6 hours of television, presumably much of it about stories. So why do we still have that? Why have we, Marina Warner asked this question, like, why have we not evolved beyond storytelling? Like, why hasn't it been replaced by something else? I don't have the answer to that. She gives some suggestions, and maybe we can talk about that. Like, you know, why are we still telling stories? You know, the first is for sex, that we tell stories as a kind of form of seduction. I'm allowed to say that, right? Like, you know. Is that okay? So maybe the first thing is that we're still telling stories because we're Aristotelian social animals, and storytelling is part of that seduction of one another, right? So we tell stories so that people will like us, or be interested in us, or find us mysterious, perhaps. Or maybe we tell stories because it's the playground of the mind, right? It's the kind of workout of our mental muscles. A third reason, probably maybe the most boring, is just simple information sharing, right? Like, this happened, that happened, go here, these are the directions to Roosevelt University, which apparently I still couldn't follow, but, right, so we tell stories because we're just sharing information. And the last, which is the one I'm trying to persuade you of, is that it's social glue, that we tell stories because it is the way to create the beloved community, right, in Martin Luther King's terms. So let's talk a little bit, or think a little bit about how Shahrazad does that kind of work. So first, I want to argue that the frame story is more than a story as ransom, but rather that what she is providing is a potent alternative form of doing politics. It's not a vehicle, her storytelling is not a vehicle of an authentic voice of the oppressed. Rather, as Hannah Arendt notes, it's an opportunity to train the imagination to go visiting. And you might recall, or if you have your book, right, in the foreword, the purpose, in this translation that I think is the one you read, for why are these stories collected, is in the second paragraph. To proceed, I should like to inform the honorable gentlemen and noble readings that the purpose of writing this agreeable and entertaining book is the instruction of those who peruse it, for it abounds with highly edifying histories and excellent lessons for the people of distinction, and it provides them with the opportunity to learn the art of discourse, as well as what happened to kings from the beginnings of time. This book, which I have called The 1001 Nights, abounds also with splendid biographies that teach the reader to detect deception and to protect himself from it, as well as delight and divert him whenever he is burdened with the cares of life and the ills of this world. It is the supreme God who is the true guide. So, like, embedded in there is nearly everything, right? Like, so the storytelling is religious discourse, right? God is the guide. It is to offer you solace. It's like mental health for, dealing with the cares of the world. And it also is an object lesson. It's so you can detect and learn about human nature and deception. So these are fairly grand claims for something that will eventually become a series of Disney movies, right? Like, whether it's, there's Aladdin and some, I don't know, is there other ones, right? My kids are always telling me about, like, when I ask them about, like, the things that they know, they're like, oh yeah, there was a Disney movie about that. Yeah. The Prince of Egypt. Yeah. Isn't that? Oh yeah. I'm like, but that's the way that goes. So there's religion, there's education, there's delight and diversion. And so the tales are both of the world, but not, they're about the world, but they're not completely of it. And I think part here is that the claim in the foreword is that we learn our feelings also through stories. I mean, we live in a post-Freudian world in which there's this idea, presumably, right, that we are not transparent any longer to ourselves. That isn't in the Arabian Nights, that idea that you can't fully understand yourself because there are animating forces that distract you from your own reality. This is an idea more that you're going to learn about who you are through the stories. And initially, right, some of you know this, right, Freud was fascinated by the arabesque, right, that kind of circular, abundance, both like aesthetically, and that it was part of the human condition, right? It was kind of an interesting idea, like that, all the artifacts in his home. I was just in Vienna, I don't know, like, it's like great to say things like that. I was on a plane. I got to go to Vienna, as opposed to like for 2 years I was sitting in my basement. And you can see, in his apartment that influence of the East, even though now when we think of Freud, we think of this idea that you can't possibly know. And I don't think that's, of course, right, that's not in the Arabian Nights, that idea that human beings can't understand themselves. Rather, I think what Shahrazad is doing is trying to shape the living memory of her culture, of the king's imagination. She is striving for narrative primacy and thus political transformation. She invites the king and we as listeners and readers through the power of these narrative dramas to participate, to interpret, and to judge the possibilities of living otherwise. The tales of Arabian Nights are text as political action. Fatima Mernissi, in her memoir, Dreams of Trespass Tales of a Harem Childhood, says of Shahrazad, quote, "I was amazed to realize that for many Westerners, Shahrazad was considered a lovely but simple-minded entertainer, someone who narrates innocuous tales and dresses fabulously. In our part of the world, Shahrazad is perceived as a courageous heroine and is one of our rare female mythological figures. Shahrazad is a strategist and a powerful thinker who uses her psychological knowledge of human beings. She makes us bolder and more sure of ourselves and of our capacity to transform the world and its people." Sorry. When Fatima Mernissi then asks her mother, "How do I learn to tell the stories that will please kings?" her mother replies that it is the work of a woman's lifetime, and that her chances of happiness will depend upon how skillful she becomes with words. Mernissi calls female storytellers then the high priestesses of imagination. Liberation, she says, starts with images dancing in your head that you can translate those images into words. And words, they cost nothing. The Arabian Nights is typically considered either as a book without an author, as Professor Warner said, or one with many authors. But what is, I think, important to remember is that all the stories from whoever's hand remained under the authority of a single and most entertaining narrator, Shahrazad. It is she who recounts the tales of wonder and intrigue, and it is the power of her narration which not only spares her life, but restores political and social order to the kingdom. Shahrazad's narrative are a medium, I think, for the powerless to speak to power. Not only do the stories enable a woman to address a king, but they also enable her to speak from her own perspective and to create for him a different moral universe. Each night, the king says to himself that he will allow Shahrazad to live only one more night so she can complete her current tale. But by the 25th night, he says to himself, quote, "By God, I shall postpone her execution for tonight and maybe many more nights, even for 2 months, until I hear the rest of the story and find out what happened to the enchanted young man. Then I shall have her put to death as I did the others." This is on page 62 of your translation. Clearly, the king is becoming enchanted by the stories and willing to forfeit, at least temporarily, his plans for execution. He is beginning to re-examine his tyrannical dictates. Of course, according to both legend and later manuscripts, in the end, the king marries Shahrazad, having learned to love and trust her. At the conclusion of the last tale, the tender tale of Prince Jasmine, the king exclaims, quote, "O Shahrazad, that was a noble and admirable story. O wise and subtle one, you have taught me many lessons, letting me see that every man is at the call of fate. You have made me consider the words of kings and peoples passed away. You have told me some things which were strange, and many that were worthy of reflection. Now my soul is changed and joyful. It beats with an appetite for life. His regime, too, is changed, as you know, when he invites both his brother, Shahrazad, to marry Shahrazad's sister, as well as to share the throne with him. The very catalyst for the crisis, the king's propensity to despotism, his decision not to trust anyone except for himself, is, through Shahrazad's words, permanently mitigated when he agrees even to divide his power. Shahrazad tells stories to examine our own buried assumptions, to address our sense of what constitutes fact, to expose our prejudices and ignorance. But these are not stories of, quote, what it is like to be oppressed, but they are rather stories of critical understanding. Shahrazad does not retell the stories of her own experience, nor does she explicitly chronicle women's experiences with patriarchy and male violence, although, as Dr. Warner suggested, there are elements of each of those in many of the stories. Rather, Shahrazad is engaged in a project of civic education, attentive to the needs and values of her audience. Yet, as the opening of the frame story demonstrates, mere storytelling is not sufficient. Recall that Shahrazad's father, the vizier, tells her two stories to try to dissuade her from her decision to offer herself in marriage to the king. Both stories are ineffectual, in part because the narrator, her father, has failed to appreciate the qualities of his audience and has chosen tales incompatible with her character. In contrast, Shahrazad relates stories which are appropriate to her audience, her sister and the king, and they are compatible with each's disposition. She is a woman with considerable learning and knowledge, not only of numerous stories, but of their many types and impacts. Shahrazad told her stories to a sympathetic but powerless sister, as well as a hostile and all-powerful monarch. She addresses both, quote, her own people as well as the hostile stranger. Her narrative moves her from being a mere carrier of culture to being a shaper of culture. Storytelling thus makes visible that facts are, makes visible the fact that an experience never just is. It is always narrated, thereby directing attention to the discourses by which experience is produced, and to the processes of transcription by what is constituted as evidence. That is, storytelling discloses the arbitrariness of the appearance of consistency, opens reality to rival orderings, and invites contrary interpretations. Again, storytelling is not a vehicle of the authentic voice of the oppressed, but rather, as I said earlier, an opportunity for the imagination to go visiting. Although it is a method a method that the social sciences demand for a fact might condemn, it is an approach with its own claim to truthfulness. And this seems important to me politically now as we debate what counts as a fact, how do we decide what is the truth, and that sometimes maybe in corporate media or even just like in casual conversations, there's this sense that if you say that there are multiple truths or critical understandings, you're somehow a relativist, right? If you were to say, in order to understand the human condition, I'm going to tell you tales for 1,001 nights, you're like, oh my God, we don't have that kind of time. But if you think that part of having that kind of multiplicity is more about cultivating judgment, then, and that's what truth requires, is the ability to judge, to think, to analyze, to review, and to reflect, not that I give you the answer, right? Or here's the truth, or right? In social science, right, where many of us are trained as political scientists, right? We assume that that's the answer. Yes, there are things that we want to name as facts, but in political life, in community life, facts are not usually sufficient to do the kind of knitting and creation of the beloved community that one would like, right? It's why Martin Luther King gives both sermons and speeches, why those sermons are both call and response, right? Like that there's a dialogic, there's an engagement. And that's part of what I think Arabian Nights shows us, is that those frame stories, why does Shahrazad end with that like cliffhanger? In part because what happens overnight is the continuing thinking and reflection and review of that story. Not only, yes, of course, it's like a ransom, right? Like, let me live another day and then I'll tell you the next part of the story. But this many, however many thousand years later that we're still reading and thinking and reviewing these stories, I think tells us that they're doing something more important than that. So I'm trying not to make a simple-minded argument about the need for better stories, say, about women. Rather, it is more in keeping with what Hayden White and Edward Said say, that narratives shape our identity. They configure our world and are an important medium through which we understand that world. Thus, narratives not only reflect the world, but they actually help to constitute it. In other words, Shahrazad goes to the king not to present him with a counter-argument, couched in his terms, that is, with reasons and rationale for why he should spare her the next morning. Nor does she simply entertain him to extend her life another day. Rather, she is narrating and thus bringing into being a new idea of rulership. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. And power. She is bringing to light insidious power relations rather than simply telling how it is. She is charting the repression that undergirds any claim that to tell it how it is, whether advanced from the center or the margin. Shahrazad is transforming what counts as knowledge and implicitly exposing the fallacy of the assumptions currently guiding the king's leadership. For example, consider the story of the husband and the parrot in the fisherman's cycle. Here, the husband gives way to an impulse to kill a loyal pet and experiences regret afterward. That is not to say, however, that Shahrazad's tales simplistically depict wise and virtuous women. Rather, her new vision is a complex moral universe. The women portrayed in Arabian Nights are both good and evil, trustworthy and deceitful, loyal and whimsical, both virtuous mothers and passionate lovers. Understanding the stories requires interpretation and judgment. There are few transparent stories with clear didactic lessons. Rather, what continues to fascinate us as readers and listeners of Arabian Nights is the way the stories seem to speak anew to each generation. And this, in part, is what is demanded of the king, the patience and perception to make judgments, to conceive distinctions, just as the tale of the husband and his parrot. The mark of a just king in the moral universe that Shahrazad weaves is thoughtfulness, not impulse, the ability to mark differentiations and evaluate them properly. And I know I've mentioned Hannah Arendt earlier, but she comes to mind for me in the ways that she talks about the banality of evil, right? This is the idea in Eichmann in Jerusalem that to do profound evil is not to have to be Mephistopheles, but to be thoughtless, to not think about what one's doing, right? It is Adolf Eichmann at his trial when asked, like, what did you think you were doing? He's like, I actually have a lot of friends who are Jews. I mean, he says this in Nuremberg, right? I have friends who are Jews. He says, I looked through the hole at one of the camps, and I saw, the despair and the devastation of the Jewish prisoners. And as I looked away, I threw up. And Hannah Arendt's like, what makes him so evil is that he cannot think. He doesn't analyze. He doesn't imagine what he's doing. He can't think through the consequences, right? He's the person who creates the schedules for the trains. He's like, I didn't kill anyone, right? And that's part of why I think Hannah Arendt and Shahrazad are saying very similar things, that it's the ability to think and to judge that creates a moral universe. It's not just about being a good person, right? I teach a morals and ethics class at the Coast Guard Academy, and there's a few of us who teach it. Every cadet who graduates from the academy is required to take an ethics class, and depending on who you get a different kind of version of of what ethics. Not that like one of us is like, oh, murder is good, and the other is like, yeah. But rather about what's the role of character, right? So some ethicists think it's character that decides whether a person is going to be good. And this is certainly part of like a military ethos, that it's about character. But mostly what we know psychologically and sociologically is that it's circumstances. That people give more money when they pass a bakery and there's a homeless person sitting outside the bakery, and the bakery is baking bread and it smells really good, right? They give more money when they're not in a hurry, right? This famous, like, devastating to seminary students of the Princeton seminary students who are, racing to class, and they're seminary students, right? Like, they are allegedly like the good people of the earth, and when they're in a hurry and they're told, like, the exam is starting early, you're going to be late, they, like, step over the people who need help. But on a regular day, like the good seminarians, like, they help people, right? So part of, I think, Arabian Nights is also kind of template about what makes us good, right? How do you have to live and behave and think in order to be a good person? And part of this is about, well, what are the stories that you live with? What are the stories that you tell yourself, about yourself, to each other? That those stories actually start to constitute the world in which you live. Which is why, probably every parent is like, you can't watch that, right? Your own parents, or if you are a parent, like, you're telling your kids, you can't watch this, it's terrible, right? Because there's some sense that, like, what you see, what you live with, what you imagine is going to create you as a certain kind of person. It's not a matter of a difference. Now, when you get to be all of your age, and we all think we're, impervious to some of it, like, sure, I can watch, 9 years of Tony Soprano, and it's not going to change my view of what constitutes a good person. But if Tony Soprano, presumably, is what is in my imagination, if that's the world in which I inhabit, if those are the stories and resources that I use to imagine what's possible, then I'm probably not, like Marcus Appel says, going to have a just world belief, right? I'm probably going to think, I'm not going to trust anybody. People are hard and wretched and self-interested, and Hobbes is completely 110% about life being solitary, brutish, and short. So Hobbes has a lot of more complicated things to say, and I'm sure that if you studied with Dr. Warner, you didn't get away with the easy version of Hobbes. Right? So, right? I guess I wonder too, like, why is Shahrazad so unafraid? Like, why is she convinced that the king will not kill her, as he has all of her predecessors at daybreak? What gives her this courage? I don't know, right? I guess I think part of it must be that she believes in this pivotal interrelationship between storytelling and politics, of the connection between narration and power. That she has an understanding of how a well-crafted story can bring light to a version of the world that transforms the way that people see. Hers is an acknowledgement that a story can be a more powerful critical force than either physical power or theoretical analysis. A skillful narrative invites the listener into its world, forming a bond of engagement between the two. A story can also bring forward the assumptions buried in apparently neutral arguments and then challenge them. Most tellingly, Shahrazad disputes the king's assumption that all women are by nature treacherous and cannot be trusted. A feminist thinker, some of you perhaps know her, Nawal el-Saadawi, argues that the veil, which is forcibly placed over minds, is much more dangerous than the veil fashioned from a length of fabric that some women in some countries use to cover their hair or their faces. So embedded and unexamined are primary assumptions of our existence that we are, she says, as though veiled. In these terms, it is King Shahryar who shares the handicap of the veil, not Shahrazad. He has only one way to understand the world. His vision is limited by the gauze of his assumptions and ignorance. Shahrazad unveils the king by giving him a wider range of ways for understanding the world. Before Shahrazad begins her 1001 Nights of narration, the frame story reveals that the king believed that what can be seen with the eyes is proof of what is true. When his brother tells him that he has seen the king's wife copulating with a slave, the king is not satisfied unless he sees the act himself. Brother, I cannot believe what you say unless I see it with my own eyes. In contrast, Shahrazad makes truth visible to the king through his imagination. These dramatic visualizations will enable the king to develop another epistemology, another way of understanding the world. Shahrazad is seeking to dislodge the authority and privilege of the master narrative of sight and to replace it with politically more astute narratives detailing particularities, contexts, and interrelationships. Her multiple narratives cannot be reduced to a single maxim. Their very multiplicity disrupts the king's proclivity for imposing his single despotic view on his people. Further, unlike sight, a passive form of reception, the narratives engage and invite his participation and interpretation. Thus, Shahrazade's narrative, her storytelling, is a democratic form. And in the Western tradition, we have a long history of whether it's Plato's dialogues, like why does Plato write dialogues? Why do we, because the interlocutors, even when he represents the arguments that he disagrees with, is part of how you get to truth and to justice. And the limitations of vision are perhaps most powerfully told in the West by the story of Oedipus, right? The king who can solve the riddle of the Sphinx but cannot answer the question, who am I? Or who is my father, right? And the blind prophet, right? Who in the play is the one who sees the truth, right? We have in the West, as well as here in Arabian Nights, a kind of critique of this epistemology, this assumption that seeing is believing. And we know this now in modern terms, that if you and I were both to witness an accident and you're just like, what happened? You and I both are standing there, your account is going to be really different from mine. Because we know that seeing is not believing. And any of you who have curated your profiles on Instagram know that, it's a different kind of version of what seeing and believing are about. After their portrayal by their wives, the king and his brother try to gain independence from women in their lives. And what results? This is like, my favorite part, is a world completely out of balance, right? The rich are afraid of the poor, the masters of their slaves, and the men are afraid of women. Shahrazad reveals that women are required for a just political and social order. And what seems to be their most important role in this restored order is as a teacher of men. Shahrazad teaches the king what it means to be a good king and a just leader. There's a similar story that in Western civilization too, the story of Antigone, right? Who the king thinks that he has dominion over the living and the dead. Antigone's brother has been a traitor and she wants to bury him, both because he's her brother and because she has obligations to the gods, right? It's kind of, many different ways to read the play. But part of the way to read the play, right, it's one of the few Greek plays with the name of a woman as the title, suggesting that she is the primary actor, but what she does is restore the balance to the kingdom, right? Creon is a despot. He, the chorus is always reminding him, like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and he can't listen to any other voices. But this is a claim that in order to have a just and ordered society, you need both feminine and masculine principles. Not that the feminine should be dominant. There's no kind of way to read Arabian Nights where it's, some fantasy that, that there won't be men or that there won't be male principles or values. It's more that there's a role for both women and men. And this perhaps part, might displease many of us, that if women are going to be in kind of traditional feminine and in some cases subordinate roles, there still has to be respect and dignity for those roles. And that's part of, in feminist scholarship, the kind of debate about the versions of the story that have Shahrazad marrying the king. Like, what does that do, right? So some feminist scholars are going to say, all this like great feminist things that, Melissa's just said, it all is like wrapped up in a bow and she's back into this institution of subordination at the end. Like, nothing's really changed. Or some other feminist scholars say, yes, there's all these kind of claims about the democratic form and the teacher of men, but it is the king who transcribes her words and preserves them, right? So we still are kind of in this world in which we know that women's words or the subordinate or the subaltern's words only count when the master narrative recognizes them. And so if those words are going to have significance, they have to be recognized by whoever or whatever is in authority. I think there are elements of truth to this as well. And I want to claim that it does something else too. First, and this is related to the work I have done and still do on women and violence, that the fact that a woman like Shahrazad can speak up and counter the king and still live in the sphere where most women then and now still experience the greatest violence, the domestic sphere, and survive, is a kind of feminist moment, right? Like, this is something quite different to say, here's this woman who, in other terms, is like acting up, acting out, saying, you know, sorry, Dad, I'm going to go do this, and hey, King, let me tell you all these stories because the way you're ruling the kingdom is not okay. And she lives, and she flourishes, right? And there are different versions, and folks who are Arabic scholars, like, you know, get very worried about all the different endings that are put here, and you know what the years are, and who decided that these different endings. And I think that's worth interrogating for the purpose of us thinking about politically how does the ending shape what we understand. I think there's some value to a woman not like Lucretia, who when she tells the story of her rape, commits suicide, or Antigone, who's buried alive. Here's a woman who speaks truth to power, and she gets her quote-unquote happy ending. It's a different kind of model for the power of speaking, or of women speaking truth to power, or whatever kind of, you know, maybe more modern term we would use for that. I feel like I should probably stop talking. What do you think? I mean, I have like more pages here, but I feel like I'm talking, and you probably have things you want to say and observe or disagree or ask, and maybe I will just say one, because I'm a professor, and I have like one more thing, is, you know, like as your students are walking out the door, like, don't you hate this? Wait, just, you know, they're like backpacks are on there, you know, they're gone. There's a new movie that I really loved and wanted to call your attention to. It's called 3,000 Years of Longing. And I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's really great, and it's based on A.S. Bayet's The Djinn in the Nightingale, one of her short stories in a collection of that title. And it is about a college professor. And she's I've forgotten what field she's in, but she, you know, she gets a bottle that she finds when she's traveling, and you know, and out jumps the genie, and he, you know, tells her that she can have 3 wishes. And the movie is all about him talking about how the stories release him, how they're part of his liberation. But the part that I think is really interesting, or one of the parts that's really interesting, is he asks her in the beginning, do you know what your heart desires? And the first 20 minutes of the movie, she's like, I don't want to have any wishes. I don't want anything. And he keeps asking. And part of the movie is this interrogation of, if you had 3 wishes, what would you wish for? And I love those kinds of questions, you know, with my students, because it's a different way of thinking about what do you want. If you had 3 wishes, now you can't wish for immortality, you can't absolve sin or suffering, and you can't ask for endless wishes. Which, because you know, remember, like when you were 7, you know, when you first learned about it, you're like, I would just ask for more wishes. Like, you're not allowed to do that, but, you know, both in various versions of Arabian Nights and in this account. But I think it's a really lovely question, right, to ask yourself. Do you know your heart's desire? And if you had 3 wishes, what would they be? And what kind of world would be created in response to your wishes, which is really what the movie is about. So if you want to kind of keep Shahrazad in your life for longer. And the flight, the opening scene in the movie, she's on Shahrazad Airlines. I'm like, who made this movie who was like, you know, just as that little, I mean, Shahrazad's name actually isn't in the rest of the film, but when they show the plane, it's Shahrazad Airlines. So thank you for listening to me.
You can take your questions, comments. Thank you.
Sure. Questions, complaints, observations.
I wondered what
So are you asking, like, is she an apologist, right? Like, do we find her somehow, like, inauthentic or disingenuous because she doesn't reveal her method to the king, right? She doesn't say, I'm going to keep telling you these stories so that you'll let me live another day because I believe that over time you will be transformed. I think when you look at, say, even the story about that the king tells about why he's convinced that women are treacherous, right? There's the woman who's kidnapped on her wedding day and then padlocked into like a box, and the king and his brother use that story as like a sign that women are treacherous. But I think for us as listeners and as readers, we think, well, maybe women have a just complaint, right? Like the story does give you enough that like she's snatched on her wedding day and there's 4 padlocks on this case that she is stuffed into. Maybe there's a reason why the king's wife and his brother's wives were unfaithful. Maybe there are legitimate grievances. And I think there are other tales that even though you're right, like she doesn't boldly proclaim what she's doing, she does tell stories that make you wonder, like, or think like, this woman has incredible moral courage because she's now retelling stories that are a rehearsal of the injury that the king has himself suffered, that in some ways seem to suggest that maybe women are treacherous, though that raises the shadow or the possibility that he is mistaken. So in that way, I think she is still doing something bold. Yeah.
If I
Yeah.
follow up, I was wondering more, is it a poor reflection on us as humans or of society that we receive, that we learn through stories instead of through direct truth? Theoretic, I'm not sure I articulated that.
So what would be like the counter? Like we would say, women really aren't treacherous because I surveyed 100 women and only 2 of them have been unfaithful about their promises. Whatever promise they made. So therefore, it is not true. I think we know too that stories move us, right? And again, I must have been reading too much Hannah Arendt last week or something. When Hannah Arendt says that, if you say to someone, 6 million Jews were killed, it's like incomprehensible. But if you tell the story of a particular Jew and what she suffered and where she went and what happened to her family and her sister, right? This is what the Holocaust Museum does in DC and in Jerusalem as well, right? Like you go to the Holocaust Museum, you get the equivalent of a small passport of a person and what happened to them over the course of the war. And as you go on every floor, you learn, what happened to this person and her family and so forth. And then in the end, you discover this person that you're given this passport of, whether they lived or died. I think that has much more of a profound effect. Think of all the atrocious things that have just happened in the last 2 weeks, right? The gun violence, right? Corporate media now makes a concerted effort not to tell you the story of the perpetrator, right? Like they are not going to give you the name of that person. They're going to try as hard as they can not to give you the background, but they're going to work very hard to tell you the story of the people who were slaughtered, right? With pictures, with their families, with interviews, in a belief, perhaps fairly obvious, that you will respond that, like, this isn't right, something has to change. Maybe you don't know how or why, but those stories will move you. Maybe, I know we don't use this language very much, but maybe this is something about the human condition, right? That we're social creatures. That's why we have language. That's why we talk. That's, Aristotle says, like, what, laughter, like, what possible purpose does laughter serve other than to show your joy in another human being, right? Like those of you who are funny, who want to make someone laugh, like, why do you do that? My daughter, who studies trauma, will say people who are funny are also covering injury, and that like humor is a way to things that are inexplicable, that you can't quite say. But that's also part of the story, right? Of, you know, why do I want to make someone laugh? Because I want to make the world a little better, perhaps because I know devastation, or perhaps because I want to bring joy, right?
Thank you.
Is that like an almost hand? No.
I was wondering if you could differentiate between the powers of fiction, which you can like capitalize on irony, or just like memoir, which like they can like really affect us and penetrate. Or each one seems to have, they're both storytelling. They also promise different things.
Right, right. So first on irony, I think I'm more likely to agree, like with Plato, that irony is an elite form. And maybe that is for me like middle school trauma. You remember like when you were in middle school and people would like, you know, like say something and everybody laughed and I would never have a clue. And I'd be like, I had no idea, right? Because everything was ironic, you know, like you're just in that age where everything is ironic. And Plato says that irony is not a democratic form because you have to be in the know in order to get it. And maybe we call it snarky now, like Rachel Maddow is the queen, or was the queen of snarky. I couldn't stand it, right? It's the kind of trafficking and like, I know stuff that you don't know, and if you were as smart as me, you would get it. So irony, I'm sure there are good uses for irony. Maybe you can help me think of some, but my like initial like, I don't really like irony. In terms of memoir, I think there are memoirs that tell the stories of a family, of something larger than the self, and then there are memoirs that are self-referential, right? That are like me, let me tell you about me, here's another thing about me. Those I think are less successful. Now, part of why we've made the world small that way in some memoirs is because we're very nervous now about making any claims about others, right? Like, I don't want to speak for you, I don't want to make a claim about my people or, you know, anything general. So I think we want to be mindful of that, but I think successful memoirs are embedded in a world, in a family, in a tradition, in a people, in a history. And so memoirs that tell us those things are, I think, more powerful than the ones that are just, you know, when I was a small child, this is what happened to me. You know, coming out stories are part of that. Survivor stories, you know, take back the night marches, right? We understand in very kind of obvious ways the power of telling a story. And I think that is part of the like lineage of what Shahrazad is doing. Now those identity politics stories are fraught now because they don't always do the work of building community. They can be divisive, they can make us think that you can't understand or you don't know because you haven't experienced. I think most of us who are academics or intellectuals always want to make the claim that you can understand. It's not the same, but you can understand because otherwise we really are doomed, right? Like if it is not possible for us to understand by hearing somebody else's story, like, you know, then we're all gonna live as kind of isolated monads in constant conflict. Not that I can tell someone else's story, but that I can understand it, right? That I can be engaged and moved and transformed by that story. That seems to me to be a really powerful part of politics, rather than I tell you my story, you tell me yours, and we're gonna fight about whose story has more authority or more whatever it is that we're looking for, you know. I think we're at a moment where it's still really difficult to do that. That's why we need all of you young people to like figure out how we're gonna do this better. And I don't know that Instagram or Twitter is the way to do it, but they are attempts, right? They are, you know, you're mostly too young to remember this, but we, you know, when the internet, like the interweb was going to be the most democratic form. It was going to create all of these communities. We were going to have all these people that, your friend group was going to expand exponentially because you could have friends around the world and you were going to learn and know and be in this kind of cosmopolitan global community. Yes, some of that has happened, right? But mostly it is vicious and rude, and the anonymity that is provided by Twitter and Facebook means that most of us are unbearable. The Chronicle even did a study of emails that undergrads sent to their professors versus things that they would say to their professor if they went into their office. And you're like, whoa. Now, I work in a service academy. No one's gonna, people are really polite. I'm like, ma'am, and eye contact and open the door. It's like a very lovely place to work. So I was kind of surprised that people would send emails to their professor that were like, this is ridiculous. I can't believe you signed 35 pages of reading this. So it hasn't created what we had hoped by being in constant conversation. So I don't want to romanticize, like, oh yes, we all,
Something you said reminded me of this issue of cultural appropriation. It seems to me like Shahrazad does that at times, doesn't he? She tells stories from Christian point of view, Muslim point of view. She has Jews in there. Would you want to make the argument that's actually a good thing, that helps her to accomplish her purpose?
Is this like a trick question?
Why do I bring that up in people? That's suspicion. Sorry.
No,
I
I
didn't mean to be a trick question.
I think it is a good thing, right? I do think it's a good thing because it wouldn't hurt for more of us to understand the ways that we have things in common. And one of the things you might notice in the tales is how often there's mourning, right? And mourning is something that every culture, most of us have mourned someone, something. Loss is part of the human condition. And many of the stories talk about that kind of mourning. And there are stories from the Torah about mourning, right? Like the cry when the firstborn are slaughtered, the mourning that happens in the Gospels. There's mourning after the crucifixion. So the stories of human mourning, of grief, and also how long it takes. This is I've written a book called When Sorrow Comes, and it's about sermons and mourning, starting with Pearl Harbor through Black Lives Matter. And so part of that Shahrazad tells these stories that have those echoes and resonances with Christianity and Judaism and other traditions, I think is a way to remind us of shared humanity. So do we all mourn in the same way? No. Religious traditions really do influence how people mourn. But the idea that you would mourn for a year, right, is something that many of the tales talk about, like how long the mourning is. Remember the one with the man who accidentally kills the son of the jinn, and he says, I want to go home and, kind of mourn with my family, say goodbye. And, for most of us when we read it, we think, oh, he's going to be back in 2 weeks. And he's like, I need a year. I need a year to say goodbye. That's I think, for us in 2022, and I argue this in the book, we don't really know how to mourn, right? We think, if you're still crying a year later, you probably need medication and a lot more therapy, right? But what if that is part of mourning, is transformative, right? It changes you when you mourn. You carry that loss, post 9/11, right? It's not supposed to be put in a little box and done. That mourning is part of the human condition. And that's just one of those themes or threads that I think when she tells those different stories, perhaps that's one of them that you notice, that you see these resonances in other religious traditions. Right? What's Antigone doing? She's trying to mourn her brother. as well as restore, the democratic order or some version of democratic interlocutors, not like representative democracy. But. Yeah.
I was really interested where you mentioned that she has two audiences. Shahrazad has two audiences, her sister and the king. And I was wondering if that points to a specific mode of political action and creating stories, like you mentioned as well. That telling a story is not just reproducing some sort of ethic, but creating it in a sense. And you mentioned Edward Said. I was thinking as well about cultural hegemony and Antonio Gramsci, and then the distinction between in the Frankfurt School between Marcuse and Adorno of what kind of political action are we doing and who is it for? I was wondering if the sort of political action that might be suggested in Shahrazad's speech to both the oppressed and the oppressor is something more like, I don't want to be too tied too closely to things in recent history, but something more like the long march of the institutions, working with the dominant hegemony and sort of trying to gradually shift that in a direction rather than trying to spark up revolution amongst the oppressed classes.
Right. It's profoundly difficult, right? Like Wendy Brown's written on under a world of like mass culture. How do you get the demos to even want their freedom? And who's the elite that's going to say, oh, this is what it is? This is what counts. Because if part of what we've just been saying is true, that the stories constitute and create us, well, the majority of stories are the hegemonic narratives of patriarchy, of capitalism, of dominance, of, that you get what you deserve, if you work hard, you're right, like, meritocracy, all these things. So if all those stories that create and that we inhabit make us certain kind of creatures, and now someone else is going to come along and say, oh, but you could live in this different way. Like, how is that going to happen? What would be how do you create that? And I think part of like Marcuse is through the arts, right? Is that, maybe that's this space that is still open, music and theater, garage bands, right? Like we thought, we collectively, whoever that might be, in the 90s, right? Like that rap music was going to do that until it became hip hop and was completely appropriated and commodified, and mostly 11-year-old white boys buy, rap music, which is fine. I mean, they should enjoy the music, but in terms of its, liberatory, quote unquote, principles of disruption, right? Didn't take very long for that musical form to be appropriated and commodified into something that seems mostly to rehearse the dominant narrative. So I want to try to stay optimistic. So how might we do that? I don't know. Like, some of it is because I don't think it is completely hegemonic. There's conflict, right? There's contrast. There's disagreements. There's still Beyonce's Lemonade. And even though Beyonce, now doing Tiffany makes me crazy. I'm like, no, Beyonce, don't do Tiffany commercials. Like, but she's still, right? I don't know if any of you love Beyonce too, right? Like, she's still, she's both part of this hegemonic, master narrative, and she's still trying to say something else about being a strong Black woman in our culture. She's still trying to, right? And I think those contrasts, right, can open up possibilities. How much, there was an article this morning in the New York Times about a Harvard Business School teaching about the history of capitalism, right? And this is like, newsworthy. Like the New York Times is like, oh, can you believe that? Instead of like our buddy Milton Friedman, they're also, now, does that mean that there's anything wrong with Milton Friedman? No, but if part of an education is that you should know all these contrasting views, think about these systems in disruptive ways, and then maybe decide, yeah, still the profit motive should be the most important thing. Still come back around to that, but at least know what the other options are, or maybe nuance that, right? I mean, most of you who are young think, yeah, okay, capitalism, but what about environment and the climate? Or, you know, why are there unions resurging at Amazon and other places? Like, so those are still legitimate questions. Where did that come from? How did that happen? You know, all of the older theories that, you know, Dr. Warner and I probably studied, where there was some belief that, like, once it got so broken, once people were so exploited, they would be like, okay, that's it. You know, like, you can't take it. And you could say maybe that's what happened at Amazon, right? You know, enough people in a warehouse, you know, passing out, some of them dying in warehouses, was enough for people to say, you know, and Jeff Bezos is flinging himself into outer space. Like, it would be really nice if he could just, like, start another medical school. You know, this is my other daughter, is like, why doesn't Jeff Bezos start another medical school? We need more medicine. We need general practitioners. I'm like, write to him, honey. I don't, you know, like, I don't know, like, why, you know, I don't know, I don't know, what do you think? Like, how do you think about that? Where are the places that you're optimistic?
Me personally?
Yeah.
No, I think Amazon unionizing is a great example of things to be optimistic about.
You know, when I studied with Wendy Brown, and she used to, you know, like when Occupy Wall Street happened, she thought, like, this is going to be this moment, right? Like, there's going to be this kind of epiphany. People are going to see the kind of exploitation and wealth inequality. But then what happened is, it seems like most of us just actually really want to be wealthy, which is part of what President Trump so, you know, for better or worse, brilliantly was able to feed into. Like, you could be me, right? Like, you could be incredibly wealthy. And that was really powerful. And this kind of belief that, you know, this very wealthy man, never mind that he inherited $1 million when he was 23, most of us would probably be wealthy if we inherited $1 million when we were 23. You know, that aspiration, I want that. You know, these goods, these things that will make me important and powerful, right? Like, that overrode the, why is it that there's this enormous wealth inequality? The likelihood that most of you who are in your 20s and 30s will make more money than your parents is now actually fairly unlikely compared to, you know, my generation, where my parents still could hope that I would make more money. That's why they work so hard, right? And that's part of what Milton Friedman says. Like, the reason that people work hard is for the next generation, right? Like, he thought that was the most important thing that kept capitalism going. It's like, it's not the tax write-offs, it's not the Lamborghini, it's this belief the next generation is going to do better. Now, he didn't live long enough, or there's not enough writing of, like, well, what would he say now? Is this like the denouement of capitalism? Because if you start to believe that my children are not going to do better, why am I working 70 hours a week? Why am I, you know, is that going to be the thing where the, you know, that's like the old Marxists, right? Like, or the neo-Marxists, or like, it's that brokenness that will create the revelation. I'm waiting a long time for that.
We've been in late capitalism for about 100 years now.
Right, yeah, you know, like finance capitalism, money makes money, right? It's the alchemy of money. Right, that's why, you know, we college professors, we all have our 401ks. Like, and it is like, it's like a magic trick. It could be in Mandarin for all I know. Like, you know, like, you open it up and there's more money, and then the next day there's less money. It's like, you know, Mark Taylor says this is like, you know, the market is like God to us in you know, the 21st century. It's like a mystery. You know, really, you know, the market. Like, it's like God. It's like some transcendent form. It has a mind and a morality of its own. I have no answers. Are we done?
So, an essential characteristic of the book is that one story leads to another story, leads to another story, stretching over 50 to 80 pages. And one wants to know why. Now, simple explanation is that Shahrazad wants to stay alive from one day to the next to the next. they don't have to lead to a continuation of continuation. They could be separate, but they're not. So do you think there's anything to the structural logic of the book, that it keeps elaborating upon itself and reflecting upon itself and mirroring itself and leading to something else that's instructive, if we go by the view that everything in the book means something much more than what it explicitly says? So is there something about this elongated, interpolated character that you think might be important politically or a reflection on human things?
I'm sure it is important. And there's a few ways that I think it might be important. One of the things I have wondered about, and maybe you have some insight into this, is why do the stories have to stop when the sun rises? Like, why are the stories and this storytelling at night in this kind of private domestic sphere, right? Like, what is it about that? Like, why can't she just tell the story? Why doesn't he just say to her, in the morning, just keep going, right? It's like, the sun comes up and the story has to end. Some scholars think this is like the difference between the sacred and the profane, that the profane belongs to human beings and the daylight and literally the light belongs to the transcendent, to the God. So the day is sacred, it's the time of worship and work and being in the world, and the night is private and dark and maybe more domestic. And so that's why the stories have this rhythm of, the when the sun rises. Which is, I find that persuasive. I think the other argument is that the storytelling is so complicated because it's teaching you how to think critically, how to, maintain the threads of I'm sure some of you find this, I find it, I have to go back and reread a section, I'm like, oh wait, what? Because the stories are so layered and they're this mosaic and their linearity isn't obvious and they're not progress narratives. So in that way, those interpolations are part of, first, just how the universe is, how human beings are, and the exercise of critical engagement is like that. Marina Warner says that the stories themselves are the arabesque, right? You know how a design that's arabesque is like a giant labyrinth and it fills the entire space, right? It is abundant. There's not a lot of empty spaces in the arabesque. It should have an image of something that's arabesque. And it's not linear. And so that's how the world really is. And so that desire for finality, for one singular truth answer is defied over and over again in these stories that are layers and take 80 pages to reach completion.
Do you think what you just said is also connected to the peculiar temporal dimension of the book, that Shahrazad is in a world that comes 200 to 500 years prior to almost all of the stories that she tells? And it's right, because she's in the Sassanid Empire,
right.
So this is from 200 to 641. And most of the stories have to do from 900 to say 1300. So she's pre-Islamic, most of the stories, not all, but most, take place in this Islamic world. So it's very difficult to get a temporal foothold on exactly where you are. And you seem to, as if you're Doctor Who, you're going into some telephone and you're going back and forth between these different temporal dimensions. You think so? That might be connected as well.
I think that, like, when we think of what are our models of history or temporality in the West, right? We have progress narratives, like the secular version, or salvation narratives, right? Like, everything bad that happens to you happens for a reason, and it will all be redeemed in the end. Or progress narratives, new and improved, right? Like, it's pretty much one word. If it's new, it is better, right? New and improved, right? right? This progress narratives. Or Fortuna, right? The Renaissance conception of, the history, time is a wheel, and you will be successful when you figure out where you are on the wheel. So if you are at the top of the wheel, you're going to behave in one way, but if you're at the bottom, something else is required. This is like Machiavelli's vision of virtue, not being virtuous, but being agile and skillful, like being able to read where I am, so that I know how to behave. That in some ways resonates with what Shahrazad is doing, right? Being able to know where you are. But what if the model of time is that it really is inchoate? That it is without direction and purpose and intentionality, right? Like Muhammad is several hundred years away, right? Notions of the transcendent that are part of the Muslim tradition are not really what Shahrazad is doing. But she's also still trying to say the world is enchanted, if not orchestrated, right? Like the idea of a providential order is probably something we don't really even think about. Even my students who will say they're atheists still believe in like karma or retribution or, like what goes around comes around. Like, do you believe in God? No. Well, then how is it that the world is organized that way? Right, like, well, so what if this is a world where none of that exists, but it still has some kind of magical thinking? There's still some part of this world that's animated by things that we don't understand, not because there's God, this anthropomorphic figure of a created order, but because that's actually just how nature is, how human beings are. That's part of what it means to be in a community, is that all these unexpected things happen, and that's part of, right, about the power of the beloved community, right? Like, already not yet. Now, granted, Martin Luther King is a Christian, and the already not yet is a way of saying, we can imagine it, we're not quite there, I don't know how it's gonna look, but let's try it, right? I mean, this is part of that idea of, I'm gonna tell you these stories, I'm gonna believe that you'll be transformed. I don't exactly know what it's gonna look like, but I'm convinced that that process will create something, in this case, beautiful, wonderful, and that you will be transformed in the possibility of it, right? Which is part of what Martin Luther King believed, which was that, and maybe it's even part of like the American Revolution, if you don't know exactly how it's gonna turn out, but you're fairly convinced that these practices will lead to something good, right? So, I don't know if any of this is making sense, or if now, it's like so fuzzy and abstract, you can hear like the crystals in the air. But these are more, I think, like the romantic ideas of what democracy creates and what a community creates. It's part of why we still, I think, in America, admire Martin Luther King so much, even though when we're angry and frustrated, or even sometimes when I'm just overwhelmed, I want to reach for Malcolm X. I'm like, this thing is rotten from the core, right? And I know how it could be better. And Martin Luther King is like, yeah, it's pretty bad. It's, it's an insufficient check. And they keep, right, in his terms, like, the United States has written the Negro a check marked insufficient funds. But maybe there's this thing that can be created from us being together in a new and different ways. We will all be transformed. Black people will be transformed. The white racists will be transformed, right? And I don't know exactly how it's going to look, but I'm fairly convinced that these practices for Martin Luther King, nonviolence, will create a kind of community that we will want to live in. And I think that you can say that's part of what Shahrazad is saying. I don't know how it's going to look, but I'm fairly convinced that this process of these stories that seem kind of wandering and that meander, and I have my sister here, and this hostile king, I'm fairly convinced that these practices will build something in a place where we will all want to live. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I can't give you the 10 principles. And some might say that's the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, right? The French Revolution had us as the model. That's how you get the guillotine. I know how this is supposed to end, and you, whoever, are not behaving in a way, so off with your head. The American Revolution doesn't have that, doesn't know, right? Sometimes you read the founding documents and you're like, oh my God, these people have no clue what they were doing. What? Like when you're frustrated, as I'm sure, like when you're undergrads, you read Thomas Jefferson, you're like, wait, this guy, how many plantations was that? And all people, what? Like, how does that work? Convinced that the practices would create this world that would be democratic, that it was a place that you wanted to live in, even though couldn't realize it, didn't know how to do it, had many kind of scrambled conceptions about power and so forth, very complicated. Maybe that's part of what we're saying about Shahrazad. It's the practices, not the ideas as much, right? It's the storytelling that will do the work. Not that, I know that women are equal. I know that women are trustworthy. I know that violence destroys the human spirit. That will come by me telling you these stories in which you get to witness that. And I'm also going to tell you stories in which women are behaved badly. And, so I'm not going to deny that reality.